And now to complete our week, focusing on the theme of women transcending boundaries. Today's distinguished panel, seated behind me, will be introduced and moderated by Nadine Epstein, editor and publisher of Moment magazine, copies of which are over here on the table for your taking when the lectures are over. It is an independent Jewish publication that is not linked to any organization or point of view. It is founded by Nobel Prize laureate Elie Wiesel and Leonard Fine in 1975 and relaunched in 2004 by Nadine. Moment is an influential voice for diverse, often provocative ideas and opinions, and through the magazine and its other projects, it aims to build a network of people interested in serious intellectual exchange on the important issues of our time. I believe that defines the Chautauqua audience. Let me just remind you that today, as every day, we will have questions. People will go from this mic to this mic. And just once more, I remind you, yesterday, everybody behaved very well. I was once a school teacher, so you can always hear that language. People ask questions. They didn't give long speeches. And part of the reason we say that is so that we get as many questions as we can and as much depth of dialogue as is possible. So without further ado, let me turn you over to the leader of our panel today. The conversation is Jewish, Christian, and Muslim women seeking clergy equality. And we are grateful to the Margaret Miller Newman Lectureship Fund for their support today. So would you join me in welcoming Nadine Epstein, who will introduce our panel for today. Thank you. Can you do it? Okay. Oops.
Hi, good afternoon. You're about to meet three amazing women who are at the forefront of women transcending boundaries in the Abrahamic faiths. Religion does not evolve on its own. It takes courageous individuals who are the first to leap into the river, to be a Nakshan ben Aminadab. He's the man who Jewish tradition tells us was the first to jump into the Red Sea when Pharaoh's army approached. By taking that action, he made it possible for the rest of the Jewish people to follow. At a time when we in America are fighting for parity of women in politics and publishing and business, it's only natural that there are women fighting for equality as spiritual leaders. And in some American religious movements, women already serve as full members of the clergy, but there are still denominations and religions, such as the ones we're going to talk about today, where change has come much more slowly. And for each step forward, there's been significant backlash. Despite this, each of the women you're going to meet today remains committed to her faith and is carrying on in her fight in her own way. Why? Because she knows it's vital to the future of her religion. And because each of these women standing on a dais as a spiritual leader has seen the tears flow down the faces of women and men sitting in the pews before them, congregants who feel a deeper connection because of their presence. And you can hear the tears of rain coming down right now. The march of history is on their side, and I should say our side, since most of us here today share the belief that women deserve parity and that religions need to open up to women in order to remain relevant. For decades, women and men in these movements have been grappling with this issue, and there has been progress. At Moment, this conversation came about after Associate Editor Sarah Brager, please stand up, Sarah. She wrote this very special story, and it's about Rabba Sara Hurwitz, who you're going to hear from, who is the first woman to be ordained by a mainstream Orthodox rabbinical authority in the United States, and who functions as a rabbi in an Orthodox synagogue. We at the magazine were able to see the huge outpouring of response to this story, and almost all of it was positive. That Rabba Hurwitz, Reverend Mary Ramerman on my left, and Amina Wadud on my right, are doing what they're doing today is a sign that times are a-changing. And before I introduce them, I'd like to just tell you that the story in this issue, Sarah Brieger's story won first place for 2010 Religion News Association magazine writing, and also the story won for layout and for best cover. And we're very proud of her. And I also want to thank Maureen Raveno, wherever she's sitting, for her vision and her kindness in setting this program up, because she was wonderful to work with. And without further ado, let me introduce these very special spiritual leaders. We'll start over there with Rabba Sara Hurwitz, who's a member of the rabbinic staff at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale in the Bronx in New York. She also serves as dean of something called Yeshivat Maharat, which is the first Orthodox school to confirm women as spiritual and halakhic leaders. And after her ordination as Rabbah in 2009, the vice president of the Rabbinical Council of America, which is the largest association of Orthodox rabbis, likened the idea of female clergy to pagan ideology. And the RCA threatened to kick out the rabbi who ordained her if more women were ordained as rabbis. So right now, she's our only rabbah. The Reverend Mary Ramerman also has an amazing story. She's a Catholic priest and the pastor of Spiritus Christi Church in Rochester, New York. Ramerman was ordained on November 17th, 2001. 3,000 people attended her ordination against the threat of excommunication by the Roman Catholic Diocese. At 1,500 strong, her congregation is now the largest non-Roman Catholic parish in the country. It's an inclusive parish that's taken a stand on ordaining women, celebrating marriages for gay and lesbian couples, and welcoming everyone to the Eucharist. And now, and on my right, as I mentioned, is Professor Amina Wadud. And she is a noted scholar of Islam, and her academic work, she's been a professor at many universities, and her academic work has focused on gender and Quranic studies, and she has helped lead the way to a theological framework for increased women's involvement in Islam. She also was the subject of controversy and debate in Islamic discourse after she bravely led a Friday prayer in New York on March 18th, 2005, breaking with the tradition of having only male imams. And she deserves a big round of applause for that. So each of them is going to start and tell you a little bit about how they got to be where they are. And Sarah, I was wondering, did you know you wanted to be a rabbi from an early age?
First of all, it's such an honor to be here with everybody and sitting on such a distinguished panel. So thanks so much for thinking about me, and it's wonderful to be here. You know, I never had that aha moment when I woke up one day and said, I want to be a rabbi, simply because it wasn't an option for those in the Orthodox community. I guess my story really begins when my family immigrated from apartheid South Africa to South Florida in '89. And my parents, without really explicitly talking about it, sent us a message of tolerance and equality, that all people should be able to do and be whatever they want. It wasn't until much later that the thought of spiritual work entered my mind. When I was about to enter Barnard College, my parents insisted that I take a vocational test to see what my skill set was best suited for. The results of the test showed I was best suited for clergy. And at the time, we all laughed, because what is a good Orthodox Jewish girl going to do with that information? And so I pursued other things in college. Can everybody hear me?
We just need you to take it off the stand. Okay, no problem. Thank you, sorry.
And so I pursued other things in college. And after working for a little bit, I began to learn full-time. It was at a place called Drisha, which was a place open for Orthodox women and women in general to enhance their learning skills. And when I graduated from there, I started looking around, and again, I realized that I was gravitating towards being part of synagogue life, communal life, being part of building community. And so I met with Rabbi Weiss, who I had known from around, and together he invited me to begin working as a congregational intern at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale. That was about 9 years ago. And the intern word is a strange phrase, because usually when you're interning for something, you're preparing to ascend to a higher level. Well, in the Orthodox community, there was no role for a woman as a full member of the clergy, so the cement ceiling was pretty low. All right, everybody see me now? So after a year of working, I was working 10 hours a week, very part-time in the synagogue. Rabbi Weiss and I, we were walking, it was the high holidays, we were walking towards a tashlich service, a service that takes place on the high holidays to get rid of your sins. And I remember both of us at that moment started dreaming about the possibility of what it would take to be accepted as a full member of the clergy. And one thing we were certain of was that I needed a certain number of years of learning to be accepted as an authority in the Orthodox community. So I went back to the books, and under the leadership of Rabbi Weiss, I took all of the relevant tests, studied all of the relevant material to become a rabbi. And after my 8 years of study, Rabbi Weiss and I found ourselves on a walk once again, and this time I turned to him and said, "I'm finished, taken all the tests, now what?" And we could have, at that moment, chosen to continue quietly, allowing me to pursue my career as a spiritual leader in the confines of my little Orthodox community in the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale. But we decided that we wanted to let other women know that this was a possibility, that this career path was an option. And so we had a public, what we called a conferral ceremony. We have to be careful with language. And it was a very moving moment where many people came together to honor my ascendancy to become a full member of the clergy. And what happened there is that people started coming up to me and saying, "How can I do what you do?" And so about a month later, we announced the opening of Yeshivat Maharat, an institution that would ordain Orthodox women to do what I do. And today we're in our 3rd year of this institution, where we have 8 women who are currently studying over 4 years to become rabbis. We'll talk a little bit more about the controversy around language and title, but that's how I got to where I am today.
Okay. Oh, you've got your own. Thank you so much. So, Mary, I have a question for Mary. Did you imagine when you were doing pastoral work at your church that someday you would be leading it as its priest?
No. No, I actually knew when I was 7 years old that I would be a minister. I had a very deep relationship with God. We talked all the time. I always think of that when I see little children. We really don't know what they're thinking about, how deep they are. But I knew when I was 7. I went on to get a degree in theology and to do a lot of ministerial work in the Catholic Church, and I had a wonderful parish that I worked with, a great priest that I worked with. We were able to do lots of work for the poor, outreaches. I was able to preach. I was able to minister to people in the hospital, do counseling, everything that I really wanted to do until I was 46 years old. And then our parish drew the attention of the Vatican. We were a large parish, and we were serving many disenfranchised Catholics, divorced Catholics, people who had felt excluded, many poor. We had many outreaches to the poor. And I think that changes you. You know, when you work with the poor, you have different priorities, and they bring things out of you. So we had a very vibrant parish, and it drew the attention. of the Vatican, and they did not like a few things about our parish. And the things they did not like were, they did not like me in my leadership position there. They did not like that women were on the altar. They did not like that everyone was invited to the Eucharist. You probably, a long time ago, maybe Catholics married Catholics, and so you could have all Catholics in a church, but that doesn't happen anymore. And Catholics are out there marrying Episcopalians and Jews and Presbyterians, Muslims. So it doesn't really work in a church anymore. So we just said, if you love God and you love Jesus and you want to receive, come up to the table. That was the second thing. And the third thing is we had many people during the 80s who were dying of AIDS. They were dying from AIDS. They were looking for churches that would bury them. In our church, we did many funerals, and many of those people were gay and lesbian. And at one point they said, you know, we don't want to just die from here. We'd like to live from here, too. And so we began to minister to that population. And as we ministered to them, became apparent that having loving relationships was part of that ministry. So we began to marry gay and lesbian couples. Well, those three things drew the attention of the Vatican. I don't know why. So in 1998, you could say the axe kind of came down. They removed a very popular priest that I worked with, who's actually here today, Father Jim Callan. Yeah, it's right there. Thanks, Jim. Mm-hmm. 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 And they began to dismantle the parish. They fired me. They fired people who were working with the homeless. And, you know, this doesn't go over really well. You can kind of fire a loudmouth priest or pastoral associate. When you start firing the saints that are working with the homeless and visiting the prison, people say, what is going on here? This is kind of crazy. And so the people in our community said, we would like to continue as a community, and we would like to know if you would lead us as an alternative Catholic community. And so we did. We formed an alternative Catholic community, Spiritus Christi. We were Corpus Christi, now we're Spiritus Christi. In 1998, we formed a new community, as we have a beautiful church. And one of the questions then, we did have 2 male priests who came to be a part of that community, but then what are we going to do with Mary? Should we ordain her? What should we do with her? And if we're going to ordain her, how are we going to do that? And I didn't know how we were going to do it either, because in the Catholic system, there was no method for ordaining a woman. So not unlike Sarah's story, we had to kind of figure that out. It took us 3 years of meeting every month. We looked for a bishop who might, on his dying deathbed, raise his hand and ordain me. We thought about an Episcopal bishop that maybe could cross-transfer the ordination. We looked for all kinds of things. We looked at maybe doing it more like a Baptist community where it would come from the people. And in the end, we realized that there are Catholic churches that are outside Roman Catholicism. I met a wonderful bishop who was from the old Catholic Church. And then he, as well as many representatives of Catholicism from around the world who were, of course, were all participating in this on a worldwide scale, came to be part of the ordination, along with many ministers from the city of Rochester who said, this is time for this to happen. So I was ordained. I did not expect to be ordained. I was working with a wonderful priest, and I didn't realize until he was removed that my ability to serve as a minister depended on the goodwill of the particular priest that I was working with. And that as soon as that person was exchanged for somebody else, it didn't matter what experience I had, what theology I had, whether I was a good preacher or a bad preacher, it didn't matter at all. Simply based on the will of one person's willingness to let a woman serve. And when I realized that it's important that we have women who are ordained. And that's when I discovered that I would be ordained. Before that, I didn't know.
Thank you. So Amina spent many years in academia. And then suddenly she took the leap from academia and her theological work and decided to lead a Friday prayer service for both men and women. And what brought you to that point? Come on up here so everybody can see you.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمد رسول الله. I begin as always in the name of God, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. Thank you for having me. Chautauqua has been an interesting experience. I am going to make a recommendation that there be a little less pork served in the cafeterias. But other than that, everything's been good. I had clam chowder yesterday, and there were bacon bits in it, so it's a little bit of a challenge. Actually, I am still a very serious academic, and it's very easy to be an academic when you are doing paradigm shifting, because all you do is splitting the hairs of certain thoughts. But as an African American, descended of civil rights and black rights movement people, the possibility of me just to do that was pretty much taken away from me in 1989 when I moved to Malaysia. And I was working with a women's organization, which is one of the most well-known Muslim women's organizations in the world now, called Sisters in Islam. And then I realized that no theory is any good if you cannot put it into practice. So it was then really that I became an activist, and the rest of the events in my life follow suit. In 1994, when South Africa was celebrating 100 days of the Nelson Mandela regime, I was on a 2-week lecture tour, and I was invited by some of the very progressive men, they were brothers, to give the Friday sermon in a mosque in Cape Town, the Claremont Main Road Mosque. And I had never even imagined this. And the reason is pretty simple. Muslims are obligated to pray 5 times a day, every day. You can do it anywhere that's clean. And although it is a very formal ritual with bodily movements, standing, bowing, standing, and prostrating with your nose down on the ground, you don't have to wait for anybody to intercede between you and God. It's a very direct, personal relationship with God. And you do it in your bedroom, you do it in your living room, you do it in your garden. It's open, and your relationship to God is not changed any way, shape, or form by where you are performing it. So as a woman, I never felt anything except for that direct relationship with God. But when I was given this invitation, it caused me great pause, because I thought, this is important, this is necessary, this is something that needs to happen. But then I didn't know. Maybe this was my own ego talking. So between 1994 and 2005, actually, I went back to the tower and did more research and did more soul search. I had to make sure that I was doing this for the reasons that I think are important. And those reasons have to do with, even though wherever a person stands in prayer before God in Islam, they stand directly before God. We send certain messages to our community by the way in which most mosques in the world are organized. And they are organized to allow the men the ultimate line, that is the first line after the person leading the prayer, and women the backmost line, or some cases in the basement, some cases in the attic, and some cases women are not allowed at all. How to be able to express to the community that although God is present everywhere, community is trying to sideline women, and to put those two together, to put both the theology of God's justice and the social experience of our performance of this ritual into the same conversation. I worked on the theology, as I said, and eventually accepted an invitation to both lead the Friday sermon, which I had done in South Africa, but also to stand to lead the prayer. And there is very, very little precedent for it, but there is no textual restriction. That is, women are not prohibited by the sacred text, the Quran, or even by the prophet's statements, nor are men specified by the Quran or by the prophet that it must be a man. Yet, the way the law was encoded 300 years after the prophet restricted women from this position by a majority rule, and that rule has been what has been in practice. And that practice continued up until the 20th century. In the 20th century, small pockets of people began to look at the alternative, including this group in South Africa, and realizing that there was no explicit theological restriction, we began to address the social and political restriction with regard to it and to challenge it by our practice. But until that time, it was done in very small circles. It was not publicized because, again, if you pray 5 times a day, having someone to lead the prayer is not a form of leadership, it is a functionary, the functionary who organizes this rigorous physical form of liturgy. But by 2005, we were ready to make a public statement. And in making the public statement, I did put myself and my family at risk. For that reason and for my faith as well, I decided not to make it a moment of personal capital so that I went on all the talk shows I was invited to or responded to all of the media requests. They literally came in at a rate of 40 a day, and I did none because if you are a believer in the context of your faith, and your faith has some traditions that reflect not the essence of your faith, the spirit of justice, the spirit of love of God, the spirit of service to humankind and all of creation, but instead that reflect the patriarchy that happens to be the part of all of our pasts and many of our presents. If you are a believer in that regard, then it is not about what you can get from it, it is also about the service that you can perform. So I did it as an act of service, and I am still being called upon to perform this same service, but usually it's done in a manner that's a little bit more discreet. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask all of the women the same question, and you guys can take turns answering it. There's much discussion today, and I know you've had this discussion earlier this week, of God embodying both the masculine and the feminine. So I'm wondering what you feel that you as a woman bring to the table that's unique, whether it's in the sanctuary or in the hospital bed or theologically or by sending a message. So, Sarah, you'd like to start?
I think everybody has a unique voice and something to bring to the table, be it men or women. I think that women are 50% of the population, and so it only makes sense that they should have a presence in spiritual leadership. I want to also just, before I continue to answer the question explicitly, just explain the difference between my title, which is Rabbah, and the rabbi title, which I think also speaks to the question. Rabbah really is the feminine of rabbi, but at least in the Orthodox context, it does imply that there are differences between the role of a rabbi and the role of a rabbah. There are 3 main things, I call them the 3 red lines, that women cannot do within the context of halacha, within the context of Jewish law in an Orthodox community. These 3 things are technical. They include counting as part of a quorum, as a minyan, acting or sitting on a beit din, or a body of witnesses to oversee a conversion, for example, and leading certain parts of services. But a woman spiritual leader can do everything else. And these 2 things don't impact the day-to-day life of what I do. And so a typical day of getting up in the morning and overseeing a life cycle event such as a Brit or a circumcision, and then being present for a couple who is struggling on a particular issue, perhaps then teaching a class, preparing for a sermon to give for that Shabbat, perhaps then meeting with a family who has just suffered a loss, performing a funeral. I'm not sure what else to call myself if not a rabbi, because that's what a rabbi does. I think that in terms of what women specifically can bring is that, as I said, we each have our unique place, but I'll just tell one story, and the story is that I received a phone call around the time of the controversy about a year ago from a couple living in Israel. And they asked me a question that they said they'd been struggling with. And after several conversations, several phone calls over a matter of a few days, I helped them resolve their issue. And when they called me back, they said they'd actually been struggling with this for 11 years and were on the verge of getting divorced because they couldn't find a male rabbi or anybody who could help them through the situation. And I think women do have a unique perspective, perhaps a more empathetic way of addressing certain concerns. And this is just one of many situations or cases of people who have sought out my service or advice specifically because I'm a woman.
Thanks, Sarah. The turning point story for me came actually before I was ordained, when I was a pastoral associate, and we would have at the church a service for reconciliation, which is a Catholic sacrament where people come and confess something that they feel they've done is wrong, and then a priest prays for them and gives them absolution. So it's a very touching sacrament. It's always given by a priest. But we had a woman in the parish who had come and said that she had actually been abused by a priest as a child, and she was afraid to come to a man. And could she come to me, tell me her confession, and then receive the prayer from the priest without him touching her? So, very pastoral moment. So we did do that. And after that, there was a line of about 40 women lined up because they wanted to talk to a woman. It's as simple as that. And that, for me, captures the essence of why we need to have women priests. Because in a woman, another woman sees a verification of their experience, someone who might possibly understand what it means to have a child that dies, to suffer abuse, to juggle 3 children and finding a time to pray, to be in a workforce that perhaps doesn't honor who they are. These are circumstances of women. And when you go into a church and you look up on the altar and you see only men as you would in a Roman Catholic setting, you're not represented there. And so my experience is that when people come in, and this is true for both women and men, when they come in, often they cry because now their holiness, their spirituality is part of the service. I'll just stop there.
What I worked on in the 11 years between 1994 and 2005, I have now been discussing in public space under the rubric of what I call the Tawhidic paradigm. Tawhid is the word that we use for monotheism in Arabic, but because of its origin as the second form of the verb, it's a very active term, and it means not only is God one, but that God is unique, and that God is united. And we have what's called the 99 names of God, or the 99 attributes, things like loving, compassionate, merciful, mercy-giving. And those are the Jamal names, the names of beauty. But God also has Jalal names, the powerful, the one that raises from the dead, the judge of all deeds. And these two are united in the oneness, in the essence of God, like two hands with fingers that are laced. So God actually contains the unity of both the masculine and the feminine attributes. In fact, I make a little joke of it because in Arabic, the language is divided in what we would call gender stratified terms. No thing is without a gender. So a table, a microphone, they're all either male or female. And sometimes people who speak Arabic get very, very literal because the only pronoun that's used to refer to God in the Quran is a masculine pronoun. In English, we have a neuter, we have the it. So what I do when I speak is I refer to God by he or she or it, interchangeably, on purpose, just to see how upset people will get by it. And some people get very upset. And I tell them, if you take that pronoun literally, how come it is that when the Quran speaks from God in the first person using we, which is a plural, how come you don't take that literal and make God into a plural? And they usually don't have an answer to that. I lived in Indonesia most recently. I've lived abroad several times, and Indonesia has only one pronoun, the same pronoun for male, female, and for it. And they got it right away. I said, you have the Tawheed language. You have the language that gives us that unity. But the most important part of the Tawheed for me is the part that capitalized on my agenda for social action and for justice, and that is that God unites. And I use this in order to deconstruct the tendency to think about women and men on a vertical scale with God at the top, men next, and women at the bottom. And I said the problem with that diagram is that women have no direct contact with God. And didn't I already say that that was the most important thing, that every person has a direct relationship with God? So clearly that paradigm doesn't work. So instead, with the Tawhidic paradigm, God is the focal point that keeps male and female in a line of horizontal reciprocity. And I use this to talk about self and other in any configuration where social injustice might occur.
Thank you. Actually, can you all come and sit up here so you can, because you can, I want to ask you two more questions, and it doesn't have to be quite so formal. What have been some of the hardest moments that you've faced in your journey? And maybe we'll reverse order here, and maybe Amina, you could speak first.
The most difficult part of the journey for me is recognizing that when you give a service to God, it does not always have to have the manifestation in this world. Nevertheless, it is this world where we are called upon to do our service to God. And sometimes I do feel a split between the service to God and the recognition by community.
I think the hardest point for me in this journey has been watching my children suffer because of it. And they were from the ages of 18 to 7 when I was going through this process of being ordained. And I was astounded at the amount of discrimination that exists in the school system and in their settings, that people would take it upon themselves to tell them how obnoxious their mother was to think that she could be a minister in the Catholic Church, teachers, coaches, people. And I think it gave me an insight into how embedded that discrimination is in our society and the message that's out there. And that was very painful to go through. I have a wonderful husband, wonderful children. We survived it, but still it's painful to take a stand and then have it hurt the people that are closest to you.
So I really relate with Mary's challenge, and I would just briefly want to say 3 challenges. The first is, I think, also on a personal level, the toll it takes on my family. My kids are, I have 6-year-old twins and a 3-year-old. But at the beginning of this year, one of my son's friends said to him, what does your mother do? And he says proudly, my mother's a rabbi. And this little 6-year-old says, well, women can't be rabbis. And he says, oh, yes, they can. And she says, oh, no, they can't. And he says, oh, yes, they can. And in their 6-year-old way, going back and forth. And when he came home and told me that story, I felt so sad that he would have to battle this concept of the fact that women cannot be rabbis in the Orthodox movement wherever they go. I would say just externally, in the external community, the challenges have been people perceiving or thinking that women who want to serve want to do so to grab the limelight or to make a statement of some kind, and not acknowledging that women really want to enhance and build community and have what to offer. About a year ago, I spoke at a community in New York, and after I finished, there was a terrible blog that was written about my appearance where one of the rabbis in the community said that this year we have one more thing to mourn about on the holiday of Tisha B'Av, which was coming up, the holiday where we celebrate or where you commemorate the destruction of the temple. This year we not only are mourning the destruction of the temple, but we're mourning the fact that women are trying to become rabbis.
So I have one very important question left for all three of you, and that is, why do you believe what you're doing is important to the well-being of Islam, of Orthodox Judaism, Catholicism, and Christianity? And what is the danger of continuing to exclude women from leadership positions? Hello. Let's go back in reverse order. We'll start with Amina.
The work that I have dedicated myself to for nearly 40 years actually has to do with correcting the historical absence of women's voice in interpreting the sacred text, the Quran. There's no restriction. In fact, the Prophet ordered women and men to study, and women did, in fact, memorize the text from the time of its revelation to the present. But there was a shift in women's participation in what I call the establishment of the major principles, paradigms, and canon of what it means to be Muslim. And women got relegated to a rather back seat. And so when you look back on the historical record, which is copious because Islam is a very literate tradition, when you look back on the record, you don't have a single indication of women's responses to the sacred text until the 20th century. None. No restriction, but still the record is not there. So when I began to work on exegesis or Quranic analysis from a woman's perspective, from which I wrote my first book, which they're going to have me do some book signing later on, hint, hint. When I began to work on it, I still had to try to emphasize that this was not some type of a plot to dishonor women. Nevertheless, if we continue to allow that absence to go into the future, that we were not fulfilling our full agency before God. So advocating the necessity for the inclusion of women's voices and women's experiences, so that in the public space we are aware that what it means to be human is not just to be a male human, and that we aspire to the good in a person no matter what the gender, that we aspire to that good, and it doesn't matter if it's in a male form or a female form. And that has been a very hard battle to wage, because when you come into the public space and you talk about things like giving birth to children, they want to relegate that once again to the private space. And I say that it's also something that characterizes what it means to live and surrender to God. So I'm making that point by both my activist work and also by my scholarship. And the nice thing is that after 20, 30 years, there's a whole cadre of people who are now coming down, and they are accepting, even in the most conservative communities, that it is necessary to always include the woman's voice.
Before we go on, Amina, could you tell us the name of your book and when the book signing is, just so you know?
My first book is called Quran and Woman, Rereading the Sacred Texts from a Woman's Perspective. And the second book is called Inside the Gender Jihad, Reform in Islam. And they're going to be over there in that corner by the Mission House right after this.
Great. So again, why do you believe what you're doing is important to the well-being of your religion, and what will happen if your religion, any religion, continues to exclude women?
Well, foundational to our faiths is the idea that men and women are created in the image of God. And it is the church's job to convey that message. And if the church proclaims that message from the pulpit, but at the same time, in the Roman Catholic system, for example, does not allow women to come anywhere near the altar, or to preach the gospel, or to give last rites, or to baptize people, or to marry people, it mocks the foundational message that it seeks to proclaim. And when it does that, it has a profound effect on society, because the men and women that are attending church are receiving that message. They're receiving the message that women can be excluded, that women can be not listened to, that women can go unnamed, that women can be left out of decisions. These are the messages that people receive week after week after week as acceptable, appropriate, and as the right thing to do. And so what happens to that message? Well, then that message goes into the boardroom of corporations. That message goes into our economic policies. It goes into our social security policies. It goes into our decisions about which countries we help, whether we're concerned about a woman and her child in Somalia, or whether we're more concerned about the oil in Iraq. It goes into everything that we're doing in the world. The church has a huge impact. I see that impact in the decisions that we're making as a society. And so it's essential that we take a look at this discrimination that's present in our systems and realize that it's not just about who you're listening to on your Sabbath day, but what happens the rest of the week after that with that message that you've internalized.
I don't think that having women in spiritual leadership is only helpful or good for the Orthodox community. I think it's good for the community at large. My students are the Orthodox voice at Interfaith dialogue, at interdenominational dialogue. And the truth is no such thing as pluralism if one part of the population is not invited to sit at the table. And so I think that the goal is to take from women who are passionate about serving and enhancing and building the community and allowing them to serve. And really that's all that we and they, my students, are hoping to do. And it's been my experience that facts on the ground show that once a community has been shown or seen a woman in the position of spiritual leadership at the helm of their community, they're opened up to the possibility to see and understand all that women and female spiritual leaders in general can bring to the table.
I know that you must have many questions for these women. Each spiritual leader here could easily fill the whole hour, and there's so much we haven't been able to cover. For example, in each of these religions, there were many women in history that we could talk about, and the history of women and how women became excluded. There's so much. But I wanted to welcome you now I want to leave plenty of time for your questions. And I also want to thank so much for Sarah and Mary and Amina for being here. So please feel free to line up at the microphones, and also don't forget, you're please welcome to take a magazine as well. Would you like to go first?
Sure, thanks. Is this working? Yeah. So thanks to all three of you. I consider you all heroes in that, what you're doing is through great personal pain. And I just want to say, as I'm sure you know, the faiths will never be the same again. So thank you for your work. I'm wondering, do you feel that you're in a position to facilitate what we might call the harder conversations within your faiths, particularly around lesbian rights to be clergy or reproductive choice, or at this particular time are these conversations that just have to stay kind of quiet?
Who'd like to answer that one?
When I worked on the Tawhidic paradigm, it was very clear to me that self and other has also to do sometimes with sexual orientation, especially since there's a very slow movement with regard to LGBTQ rights in the Muslim context. So I've been what I call an outed ally for some time. I use the same justification that we are all one before God, and therefore sexual orientation does not make a person less or more before God.
Thank you. Is it your turn?
Assalamu alaikum. Following the death of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, Aisha radiallahu anha was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Muslim nation and held that office for the next 39 years. To what extent would you agree with that proposition or disagree?
I would disagree with it. Aisha made an important contribution to the development of the Islamic schools of thought, but by the time she died, 39 years later, the 5 major Sunni mudhahib and the Shia major madhab had not even been formed. It took another 200 or 300 years. And by the time the schools of thought were actually formulated, women became the subjects of the law and not the makers of the law. And even with regard to things like menstruation, men were advised how to respond to women with regard to it. So what strength she had in her contribution did not outlive her role in her lifetime.
Thank you. Your question?
What are your thoughts on the Vatican requiring conformity by women's religious communities and requiring them to report their conformity? Any one of you can answer.
I'll take it. One of the things that I loved about the Catholic Church was that its diversity, that you could go to a quite conservative Catholic Church, a quite liberal Catholic Church. There are all different kinds of orders of women, there are all different kinds of orders of men, contemplative, social activists. And so why in the world would we want to suddenly decide that everybody should conform to one pattern, one way of thinking, one way of expressing our faith? I think it's fear that's activating those kind of proclamations, fear that there's going to be a loss of power. And in fact, I think unless that fear is resolved and love replaces it, there will be a loss of power. There'll be a huge loss in the church, and that the only way to reactivate that is to open the hands up and open the arms up like Jesus did, not to hold everything tightly.
Thank you. It's your turn.
Yes. All 3 Abrahamic religions believe that the nature of God is infinite. And so the attribution of attributes helps us, but really doesn't define the nature of God. The Imam has been very clear that she uses various pronouns and the neutral to refer to God. I don't know if she refers also to God the Mother. But my question is to the other 2. In your services, do you refer to God as the Mother or as she?
I think, like in our own conversations, don't believe that God has a gender. I try to be very careful about my God language. I call it, certainly in Orthodox communities, the pronoun given to describe God is he, and so most of the community does refer to God as he, but when I am giving sermons or teaching in general, I am very mindful of ensuring that God does not have gender, and my my 6-year-old does refer to God as she, and that comes just from a natural place, not because we have driven it one way or other, but he just feels a sense of God in the feminine.
I resonate with what Sarah just said, and in my community, I like to use terms like Yahweh or loving God. And I also try to use both male and female pronouns, because for some people that is how they experience God, so I don't want to erase that, but add to it.
Thank you.
Your turn.
I applaud the courage of all three of you, my clergy sisters. You are pioneers in each of the three faiths you represent. My question is, I'm a Presbyterian clergy woman, ordained 22 years ago, and I was in the second or third wave of Presbyterian women to be ordained. My question is, do you see second and third waves of people following you? You are the pioneers. Do you see people coming along behind you? And that's for all three of you.
I think all of you have to answer this one.
I think that there's been a natural evolution towards equality. The first woman was ordained in the Reform movement in 1971, 10 years later in 1974, and it took until 2009 for somebody to be ordained in the Orthodox community. But I think we have equality on our side, and I think that's the same to the question that you had asked earlier, just about issues relating about equality. I think that's the direction we're all moving towards. I think the difference within the Orthodox community is when the other ordinations occurred, there was establishments behind those movements. So the JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary, or HUC, the Reform movement, gave their stamp of approval after much back and forth over women becoming rabbis. In the Orthodox community, we're trying to establish that institution to help further women becoming rabbis.
In the Catholic community, there are now organizations that are training women and ordaining women. There are now women bishops that have been ordained secretly by male bishops that are ordaining women. There's probably close to 200 now, and it's a worldwide movement. So I think it's just a matter of, at some point, there'll be more women priests than there are men, and the scale will tip.
2005 was really only 6 years ago, but there have been leaps and bounds of change in terms of the Muslim community, and it's very interesting to watch how it unfolds. But once the conversation came into the realm of public debate, those who were holding on to their male privilege were really hard-pressed to defend that, because the evidence was not in their favor to continue that exclusion. And as such, there are increments, and there have been like much larger official opinions, legal opinions or fatwas that have been issued finally to accept the possibility of women as imams. And there have also been interesting efforts, that is, girls in religious schools in Indonesia who would lead the prayer. So I'm watching it happen at both the level of officialdom and also at the level of the grassroots. And eventually all of that will come together, and there really will be a kind of a mass consensus that is not only a good thing, but also a necessary thing.
I'm sorry to say that because of time constraints, we can only take the people who are at the mics now, and for their questions, but afterwards everyone should feel welcome to come up and ask their questions individually. So Anita, would you like to ask?
Yes, I'd like to add, and I want to, I want to add, say, along with the sentiments of so many other people, that you are first in your field and really have to be acknowledged for the courage and the stand which you've all taken, and to be admired. And it's not easy in any case to be the first. My question is going to be directed to Rabba Sara Hurwitz. You mentioned that in Orthodoxy, and I know this, that you are not being recognized as a person to be counted in a minyan or to be serve in a rabbinic court. Do you feel in your position that you can be an advocate in the Orthodox world to promote women to be accepted in a minyan and on a rabbinic court, especially on a rabbinic court where so many divorce cases are brought forward and there's no woman's voice heard?
These are very painful issues. They're not simple. And the fact is that there's certain, as I said, red lines that I think within the Orthodox community we're not able to push too much. But I can tell you what we are doing. And I think that I feel that we are pushing the envelope within the Orthodox community, because although I cannot sit on a Beit Din and actually be the one to oversee the conversion, for example, I work very closely with converts and with anybody interested in learning about Judaism. I can be at the mikveh when a woman immerses in the ritual body of water, when a male rabbi cannot. I think about the fact that Rabbi Weiss, who ordained me, has certain limitations because he is a Kohen or a priest, so he cannot function in a capacity at a funeral, but I can. And so there are things that I cannot do, and I don't know what the future holds, but that's not where my fight is right now. I do feel that despite the fact I don't count in a minyan, I can still create a presence and be a present in a prayer service and lead a service in my own way.
Thank you.
We have one more question over here.
I'm actually just profoundly moved this afternoon. And one of the things that I have been thinking a lot about is your intellectual commitment to your communities, to your study of religion. And so my question is, where do you draw that inner strength when someone is coming at you with their own discourse, who maybe has studied and put in as much time and effort as you have, who wants to try and maybe keep you down and keep you in your place? Like, how do you stay strong in that?
It's a great question. You want to start that one?
I think it was probably the first and most important thing that I had to come to grips with, was finding that core of inner strength. I call it the well of springing water within me, to be able to deal with the criticism that comes externally. And I think that all of us in our spirituality, in our spiritual journey, seek to find that that sense of self from within, from that relationship with God. And it's important for me in my spirituality that I stay focused on that my prayer be about that my connection with God be strong, so that I'm not going up and down all the time with either the criticism or the affirmation, either, that's coming from the outside. And I can only say that it's core to my ministry, and I know right away if I haven't spent enough time in prayer. It becomes very obvious to me. So my source of strength is my relationship with God.
In addition to that, I mean, because obviously you do have to draw from the wellspring of your own inner conviction and love of God and love from God. But in addition to that, as an activist, I've realized how important it is to have a strong network. And between me and you, I'm really happy for things like Facebook and Twitter, because my community is not all located in one place on the map. I've lived, in 5 different countries, and I have friends and activists and scholars that are all over the world, and they're available in any second. And I've learned, in terms of working on gender issues in particular, that you really need to form networks of people who have expertise in areas that you do not have. But the other thing is, as I get older, and I really find this really important, I've developed a sense of humor.
Sarah.
I just to build upon what's been said already, I do feel that God really has God's stamp of approval on what I'm doing. I really think I'm fulfilling God's work, and I think that helps me continue doing what I do because I have a sense of belonging. I'm not afraid of my title as Orthodox woman. I embrace it. Orthodox rabbi or a rabbi, I embrace it. And I think it's because I feel spiritually this is really what I'm supposed to be doing. I can't imagine doing anything else with my life. And I also do think that community is so important. I wouldn't be able to do it without the network of supporters, both familial as well as my community at large.
Again, I want to thank these amazing women, and very special to be here with you guys today, with you today, you women today. And feel free to come up and talk to us, to them.